Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon was the most famous fashion designer in the world. She invented the modern runway. She dressed queens, duchesses, and silent film stars. She built the world's first international couture house, salons in London, New York, Paris, and Chicago, all under a single name, Lucile. And then, on the night of April 14, 1912, she stepped into a lifeboat on the RMS Titanic. The boat was built to carry 40 people. Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon left in it with 11 others. When the ship went down and more than 1,500 people died in the water around her, that lifeboat never went back. The press called it the Money Boat. They called her the woman who let people drown to protect a nitress. The British inquiry cleared her of bribery completely, but the newspapers had already decided. And the story they chose to tell about Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon, the Titanic villain, the coward in the lifeboat, buried the other story so completely that most people today have never heard her real name. This documentary does not restore the Titanic lifeboat. That story survived just fine on its own. This documentary restores the woman the lifeboat erased. She did not begin with money. That is the first thing to understand about Lucile, because everything about her public image eventually suggested the opposite. Lucy Christiana Sutherland was born in London in 1863, the eldest daughter of a civil engineer who died of typhoid fever before she was 2 years old. Her mother raised 2 small girls alone, eventually settling in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, before moving back across the Atlantic to the island of Jersey. Lucy received a patchy education, some Canadian grade schooling, some tutelage from governesses, no formal artistic training, no design apprenticeship, nothing that would have identified her, at 16, as a future revolutionary. What she had instead was an eye. From childhood, she was drawn not simply to fashion, but to something more precise, the relationship between a garment and the person wearing it. She collected fashion dolls. She studied clothing in family portraits. Long before she had the language for it, she was already asking the question that would define her career, not what a woman should wear, but who a woman was, and how cloth could make that visible. In 1884, at 21, she made a poor match. James Stuart Wallace was a wine merchant who drank too heavily and was regularly unfaithful. The marriage produced 1 daughter, Esme, and a private unhappiness that grew until Lucy could no longer sustain it. She separated from Wallace around 1890. The divorce was finalized in 1893. She was left with very little: a daughter to raise, a mother's flat in London to live in, no income and no obvious path to one. So she did the only thing that made sense. She began to sew, not from passion, from necessity. Working from her mother's drawing room at 25 Davies Street, she started making dresses for acquaintances, charging modest fees for garments that began attracting a particular kind of attention. Not simply admiration. Inquiry: who made that? Where did you have it done? The first real turning point came at a weekend house party. Lucy had made a chiffon tea gown for a prominent politician's wife. When the woman wore it, the room changed. Requests followed, then more requests, and within months, what had begun as survival had started to resemble something entirely different. In 1893, Lucy opened Maison Lucile at 24 Old Burlington Street in London's West End, a short walk from Savile Row. From the beginning, she was doing something other dressmakers were not. Victorian women's clothing was governed by restriction. The fashionable silhouette of the 1890s demanded tightly boned corsets, rigid bodices, and multiple layers of structured underskirt beneath the visible gown. Dressing was an act of physical discipline. Fashion, in the accepted sense of the word, was something imposed on women's bodies, not an expression of who those women were. Lucy thought this was not only uncomfortable, she thought it was wrong. She began quietly dismantling the architecture underneath. In a room at Maison Lucile lined entirely in pink taffeta, In a decade when respectable underwear was supposed to be white and functional and entirely invisible, she displayed lingerie that no dressmaker in London had offered before. Pastel silks trimmed with velvet bows and delicate lace. Pale knickers in colors that had no business existing next to a lady's skin by the standards of the age. Small silk rosebuds. Pieces with no purpose other than to be beautiful against the body beneath the gown. Pieces designed, in their quiet way, to make the woman wearing them feel that her private self deserved the same attention as her public one. Women came to look, Lucy recalled later, before they had the courage to buy. They came in groups, she remembered, and they stood in that pink taffeta room and looked at things they had never been offered before, things they had apparently always wanted without knowing it was permitted to want them. Half of them left without buying anything. But they told other women what they had seen. And those women came. And eventually, when aristocratic women in the Prince of Wales's circle began wearing Lucile's lingerie, when society's most untouchable women declared by their example that wanting to feel beautiful underneath was not improper but simply honest, the hesitation dissolved almost overnight. The gowns that went over that lingerie followed the same philosophy. Low necklines, slit skirts that allowed women to actually walk, to actually move, without gathering yards of resistant fabric at every step. Soft, floating fabrics, diaphanous chiffon, gossamer lace, layers of shimmering silk and pale romantic colors that suggested morning light rather than ballroom formality. Garments designed so that a woman could breathe and feel like herself rather than be displayed as a structure. She described the governing principle of everything she made as dressing women from the inside out. She dismissed the rigid corsetry of her competitors as the dull, stiff-boned bodiced brigade, in public, in print, at a time when a woman in trade saying anything like that was considered nearly scandalous. She called her designs personality dresses. Each gown was built around the individual psychology of its wearer, her mood, her spirit, her private understanding of herself, rather than the seasonal program of the Paris houses. She gave them names that no fashion house had ever used. The harvest of sin. Give me your heart. Why do you hesitate? The sighing sound of lips unsatisfied. These were not advertising copy. They were Lucy's genuine argument that clothing, at its best, was a form of self-knowledge, that the right dress made a woman legible to herself in ways that the wrong dress actively obscured. The concept sounds obvious now, embedded as it is in everything from bespoke tailoring to the language of personal styling. In the 1890s, it was unlike anything the fashion world had articulated, because the fashion world, in the 1890s, had never been asked to articulate it by someone with Lucy's particular combination of conviction and commercial talent. By 1897, Mason Lucile had outgrown Old Burlington Street. She moved to 17 Hanover Square, and then, around 1903 and 1904, to 23 Hanover Square, the address that would become the permanent home of Lucile Limited for the next 2 decades, and the setting for the most consequential afternoon in fashion history. In 1900, before that move, Lucy remarried. Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon was a Scottish baronet, a landowner, and a distinguished amateur fencer, a man of rank and reputation who did something that required genuine independence of character. He married a divorced woman. In the social world of 1900, that choice cost Cosmo something. He waited until after his mother died before he proposed. The marriage gave Lucy a title, Lady Duff-Gordon. It also gave her a social position that should have been incompatible with running a commercial business. Titled aristocrats in Edwardian England did not work in trade. Lucy made them compatible by simply refusing to acknowledge any contradiction between them. She was now a woman of rank who dressed queens, a couturier who moved in the rooms her clients inhabited, a designer who understood, from the inside, what it meant to be watched, to be judged, to need the right dress at the right moment. That particular form of understanding was worth more than any formal education she had never received. And she had built it entirely from her mother's drawing room, with a needle, thread, and the unshakable conviction that women deserved to feel, in the clothes they wore, exactly like themselves. On an afternoon in July 1904, something happened at 23 Hanover Square that the fashion world had never seen. The great and good of London society, their invitations printed like theatre programs, their tea served by hand, filled a large Georgian room where a stage had been built at one end. An orchestra played softly. Curtains waited. The guests held their programs and read the names of the dresses they were about to see. Not numbers. Not descriptions. Names. Passion's thrall. Give me your heart. The sighing sound of lips unsatisfied. Then the curtains opened. 6 young women walked out. Lucy had spent months preparing them. They were not professional performers, most were former shop girls and young apprentices from working-class backgrounds, but she had subjected them to a rigorous transformation. Lessons in posture. Hours spent walking with books balanced on their heads. Trips to the hairdresser. She gave them stage names: Hebe, Gamla, Corisand. Singular. Evocative. Designed to make each woman feel less like a shop girl wearing a dress and more like the living embodiment of one. They walked. They turned. They moved through the room with the particular unhurried confidence that only rehearsal produces. The audience sat forward. Lucy had understood something no other designer had yet articulated. A gown in motion communicates what a gown on a hanger never can. The dress was not the thing being sold. The feeling of wearing it was the thing being sold. And to sell a feeling, you needed a performance. The fashion show, the staged presentation, the runway, the lighting, the music, the carefully selected audience, begins in that Georgian room in 1904. The documented credit for that invention belongs entirely to Lucile. And the women who came to those early showings were not ordinary clients. Queen Mary, while still Princess of Wales, wore Lucile designs. So did the queens of Spain and Romania. Margaret Asquith, wife of the Prime Minister, was a regular. The Countess of Warwick, among other things, a former mistress of the Prince of Wales, came to Hanover Square. Lily Langtry, Ellen Terry, Sarah Bernhardt. The guest list at a Lucile presentation read like a private inventory of Edwardian power, gathered in a single room to watch girls named Gamla walk across a stage in gowns named Passion's Thrall. Then came Lily Elsie. In 1907, France Lahar's operetta The Merry Widow opened at Dolly's Theatre in London. Lily Elsie was then the most celebrated ingenue on the London stage. A young woman whose face appeared on postcards sold across the country, whose appearance in any production guaranteed a full house. Lucy designed every gown she wore in the production, and among those gowns was a hat. Large, plumed, sweeping. Lucy had reached back to the wide-brimmed Gainsborough hats of the 1780s, the hats that appear in Gainsborough's portraits of 18th-century women, broad and softly dramatic, and carried them into the Edwardian present with a theatrical confidence the West End had never quite encountered. The hat was not simply large. It had presence. It had architecture. It communicated, from the moment Lily Elsie walked onto the stage, that the woman wearing it understood something about beauty that smaller gestures could not express. Within weeks of opening night, London's hat makers were inundated with requests. Photographs of Elsie in the Lucile hat, taken for press and promotion, then reproduced in newspapers across 2 continents, circulated further than the production itself ever could. Women who would never see the operetta recognized the hat from the photograph. The hat became a cultural event of its own, entirely separate from the show that produced it. Fashion historians document that the picture hat trend it launched lasted approximately 5 years, remaining fashionable until around 1912. One design, one production, half a decade of imitation. That is the measure of what Lucy understood about the relationship between fashion and theater, between what a woman wore on a stage and what every woman in the audience wanted to wear the following morning. No other British designer had grasped it. Most Paris designers had not either. Meanwhile, the business expanded in a way that had no precedent in the fashion world. Lucile Limited was formally incorporated in 1903. New York opened in 1910. Paris in 1911. Chicago in 1915. Not a Paris house with foreign clients, a genuinely transnational operation with separate salons, separate staffs, separate directional strategies on multiple continents. Lucile Limited was, by any honest measure, the world's first international couture brand, and it was built by a woman who had no business training, no inherited capital, and no formal design education. Florence Ziegfeld commissioned her for the Ziegfeld Follies reviews, beginning in 1915. The visual spectacle that made the Follies famous, the elaborate siren gowns, the Egyptian-inspired ensembles, the theatrical grandeur, was in significant part Lucy's creation. In Hollywood, the silent film industry was discovering that its stars needed a particular kind of dressing. Mary Pickford, Marion Davies, Norma Talmadge, Irene Castle, women whose images were reproduced in newspapers across the world, wore Lucile designs both on screen and off. The design historian Randy Bryan Bigham has documented that Lucile's aesthetic became, in effect, the first Hollywood look, the visual language that early cinema developed for its most visible women. She costumed more than 80 films during the silent era. She wrote fashion columns for Harper's Bazaar, for Good Housekeeping, for the Hearst newspaper chain, reaching millions of women who would never visit Hanover Square but who absorbed their understanding of elegance through Lucy's words. Her columns argued, month after month, that fashion was not a decree from Paris. It was a conversation between a woman and her own sense of self. The idea of a designer as a public voice, a columnist with authority and opinion, is so familiar today that it barely registers as an innovation. Lucy invented it. In 1917, she launched a mail-order line through Sears, Roebuck and Company. The fashion establishment was appalled. A couturier who had dressed queens was offering her designs to middle-class women at kitchen tables. Lucy was unmoved by the objections. She had always believed that the quality of a woman's inner life bore no relationship to her income, and that the right dress should be available to every woman who understood what clothing, done properly, could make possible. She had grasped the democratization of fashion half a century before the industry arrived at it. The gowns survive. Several hold permanent places in museum collections, including that pale 1913 silk at the Victoria and Albert Museum, folded in its tissue paper, its embroidery still holding the ghost of the woman who wore it. The Fashion Institute of Technology in New York holds photographs and original Lucile sketches. Auction rooms in London and New York still surface her work: silk organza evening gowns, metallic gauze coats, afternoon dresses in the layered pastel silhouettes that were as distinctly hers as a signature. Each one carries the label, Lucile Limited. The surviving objects do not argue for her place in history. They simply occupy it. And then she got on a ship. On the evening of April 14, 1912, Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon was not traveling for pleasure. She had booked first-class passage on the RMS Titanic on business, to check in on the New York branch of Lucile Limited, which had opened 2 years earlier. She and Sir Cosmo had made the booking under the names Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, a precaution, apparently, against the press attention her name invariably attracted on arrival in New York. Her personal secretary, Laura Mabel Francatelli, known affectionately to the family as Miss Franks, was traveling with them. At 11:40 that night, the ship struck an iceberg. During the evacuation, Lucy, Cosmo, and Francatelli made their way to the starboard side. They came to emergency lifeboat number 1, one of 2 small wooden cutters, designed for 40 people, already swung out from the ship's rail for rapid deployment. First Officer Murdoch, overseeing the starboard evacuation, permitted 5 passengers and 7 crewmen to board. The 5 passengers were Sir Cosmo, Lucy, Francatelli, and 2 other men. The boat was launched at approximately 1:05 in the morning. 12 people. In a boat built for 40. The Titanic sank at 2:20 a.m. Lifeboat 1 did not go back. What happened in those dark hours on the water became one of the most contested episodes in Titanic history. What is documented is this: after the ship went down, a fireman named Charles Hendrickson raised the possibility of returning to look for survivors. The suggestion was not acted upon. Some time later, Lucy made a private remark to Francatelli, something about a nitress that had gone down with the ship. A fireman overheard the comment and replied, with some heat, that while the couple could replace their possessions, he and the other sailors had lost everything, including, since the Titanic had sunk, their wages. Sir Cosmo responded by offering each man £5 to help him re-equip. On the Carpathia, he wrote out the checks. It was a private act of generosity toward men who had lost their livelihoods. The press turned it into a confession. Within days of the Carpathia docking in New York, the tabloids, the Yellow Press, as Lucy later called it in her 1932 autobiography Discretions and Indiscretions, had constructed a narrative that was vivid, damning, and not supported by the evidence, that Sir Cosmo had bribed the crew to row away from the drowning, that Lucy had insisted on abandoning the survivors, that the £5 were the price of silence rather than an act of ordinary human compassion toward men who had nothing. The phrase that attached itself to Lifeboat 1 entered the permanent record. The Money Boat. The Duff-Gordons were summoned to the British Board of Trade inquiry into the disaster, the only passengers called out of 102 witnesses. Lucy appeared on May 20th, dressed in black with a large veiled hat. She told the inquiry she remembered little of the conversations in the lifeboat and could not recall specific exchanges. The room, according to contemporary reports, was packed with society women wearing their Lucile gowns, an extraordinary detail that said something about the gap between who she was and what the newspapers were saying she had done. The inquiry's final report was unambiguous. The gross charge against Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon, that he had bribed the crew to row away from drowning people, was unfounded. The presiding judge, Lord Mercy, concluded the £5 payments were a private act of generosity poorly timed rather than criminal. He added one qualification, that Cosmo ought to have exercised more leadership and organized a return to the site of the sinking. That qualification was the sentence that traveled. Legally cleared. Publicly destroyed. The image was simply too compelling to relinquish, a titled fashion designer and her baronet husband floating in an almost empty lifeboat while 1,500 people died around them, making remarks about a nitress. It did not matter what the inquiry found. The Money Boat was a better story than the truth, and it circulated far further than the report of any judicial proceeding. Lucy wrote, decades later, that she had not quite minded the coverage for her own sake. She minded it for Cosmo. He had married her when marrying a divorced woman still cost a man his social standing. He had accompanied her on a business trip he made entirely for her benefit. He had offered £5 to sailors who had nothing left, and spent the remainder of his life trying to recover from that gesture. Sir Cosmo Duff-Gordon never fully recovered. The cross-examination at the inquiry, the sustained contempt of the yellow press, the label that could not be unstuck from the boat, it accumulated, quietly and permanently, into something that broke him. He died in 1931. Lucy wrote that the whole affair had well-nigh broken his heart. If you have been watching this channel, you already know what we come here for. The women whose work outlasted their recognition, whose names disappeared while their creations survived. If you haven't subscribed yet, this story is exactly why this channel exists. There is a great deal more still to tell. The Titanic had done its damage, but it was not working alone. The public image of Lucile, elegant, untouchable, the designer who dressed duchesses, had always depended on a particular aura of being above ordinary life. The Money Boat had punctured that aura in a way that inquiry testimony could not repair. The woman who had once existed above scandal now lived inside one, and the business was under pressure from other directions entirely. The First World War forced the Paris branch to close in 1914. Lucy relocated to New York, and the American operation carried the weight of the entire company through the duration of the conflict. In 1917, she organized a charity fashion review, Florette's dream at Peronne and toured it nationally to raise funds for French war relief, performing before President Woodrow Wilson in Washington. The effort was genuinely significant. It was also executed at a moment when she was already exhausted from years of running a four-city business through a war she had not anticipated. The same year, 1917, a legal case bearing her name was decided by the New York Court of Appeals. A business agent named Otis F. Wood sued Lucy for breach of contract, claiming she had placed endorsements with Sears, Roebuck without honoring the exclusivity they had agreed. The court ruled against her. The case, Wood v. Lucy, Lady Duff-Gordon, is still cited in American contract law classrooms more than a century later. Students invoke her name as shorthand for a foundational principle of implied obligation. Not one of them, in most cases, knows what she actually created. There was one additional detail from those years that history has not paid sufficient attention to. 3 years after surviving the Titanic, Lucy booked passage on the RMS Lusitania for what would become its final voyage. She cancelled, reportedly due to illness. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania was sunk by a German torpedo off the coast of Ireland, killing nearly 1,200 people. She had already survived one ship. The second one she survived by not being on it. Then came the restructuring of 1918 and 1919. The business, under financial pressure from the war, the cost of operating across 4 cities, the emerging reality of a changed market, agreed to amalgamate with a wholesale operation. Lucy resigned as chairman in 1919 but remained as chief designer. The arrangement failed. By 1922, after what her biographers described as an acrimonious public dispute, she severed all ties to Lucile Limited. The company that bore her name continued without her. It gradually diminished. Eventually it closed. What severed her from it was a disclosure that, in any other context, would have been unremarkable. The restructuring dispute became public. In the acrimony that followed, it emerged, and was attributed to Lucy herself, that many of the dresses sold under the Lucile name in recent years had not been personally designed by her. The New York and Chicago branches had employed design assistants, among them Edward Molyneux, Howard Greer, and Travis Banton, each of whom would go on to become a significant figure in his own right, working in what records describe as the Lucile look. This was standard practice for any couture house operating across multiple cities. It was how large fashion businesses had always worked. The press was not interested in the nuances of couture house operations. The press was interested in a simpler story, that the name on the label didn't match the hands that held the pins. The Titanic had tarnished her reputation as a person. This stripped her reputation as a designer. She had survived the ocean. She could not survive the industry she had invented. Fashion finished the work. The world that emerged from the First World War had no interest in gowns of emotion. The flapper aesthetic of the early 1920s was geometric, short, unromantic, the deliberate visual opposite of everything Lucile had built her empire on. The diaphanous chiffon, the cascading lace, the pale romantic silks, the names like poetry, all of it looked, by 1922, like another century. The women who danced in the 20s did not want to feel like Lily Elsie in a Merry Widow hat. They wanted to be unrecognizable to the women their mothers had been. Fashion turns sharply away from whatever came before, and what it leaves behind often disappears from critical favor for a generation. Lucile's romantic language was precisely what the 20s were reacting against. Lucy spent her later years in a succession of small boutiques, selling imported clothing, working for private clients. She continued to write fashion columns, her voice still sharp, her eye still precise. But the house was gone. The title remained. The talent was still there. The empire was not. Sir Cosmo died in 1931. 3 years later, cancer made itself known. On April 20, 1935, Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon died in a nursing home in Putney, London. She was 71 years old. The Times published a notice. So did the New York Herald Tribune and the New York Times. A headline in the London Daily Sketch read, "She changed Eve's dress." That was accurate. And yet the notices that traveled furthest in the decades that followed were not about what she had created. They were about Lifeboat 1. Go back to that dress in the Victoria and Albert Museum. It is still there, pale silk, the faint impression of embroidery along the bodice, where beadwork once sat so precisely that the stitches themselves disappeared beneath the surface, the craft made invisible so that only the beauty remained. A 1913 gown, designed under the name Lucile, worn once by a London socialite named Heather Furbank, then preserved in tissue paper for over a century. The museum can tell you exactly who wore it and when. What it cannot show you, what no label or provenance card can quite capture, is the intelligence that went into every decision the garment required. The choice of silk, the angle of the drape, the precise distribution of weight that allowed the skirt to move as a woman moved rather than resist her. The understanding, embedded in every stitch, that a gown should tell the truth about the woman wearing it rather than impose a fiction on her. That understanding belongs to Lucy. It belongs to her still. The V and holds the dress. The Fashion Institute of Technology in New York holds photographs and original Lucile sketches in its special collections archive. Auction rooms in London and New York continue to surface her work, Lucile-labeled gowns in silk, organza, and metallic gauze, afternoon dresses in layered pastels, each one carrying an address, 23 Hanover Square, or West 36th Street, New York, or the Paris House, or Chicago. The objects move through the world quietly with the dignity of things that were made to last. What Lucile built did not disappear with the company that bore her name. The runway show, the staged presentation with lighting, music, trained models, and a program listing the names of the gowns as though they were characters in a play, is her invention. Fashion historians across academic institutions document this without dispute. Every collection shown anywhere in the world, from Paris to Milan to New York to Tokyo, descends in a direct line from the afternoon at 23 Hanover Square in 1904 when Lucy opened curtains on girls named Hebe and Gamla and taught the fashion world that clothing was a performance, that a dress had to be seen in motion, on a woman who moved with intention, before its full meaning could be understood. The professional fashion model, trained, rehearsed, given a stage name and a stage presence, understood as a skilled professional rather than a shop dummy, begins with those working-class women Lucy assembled in that Georgian room and subjected to months of preparation. They became, as one contemporary account noted, the incarnation of enchanting womanhood. Lucy made them that. It was deliberate. It was work. The idea that a dress should express the psychology of the woman wearing it, rather than simply conform to the season's decree, is now so fundamental to couture that it requires no argument. Every personal stylist who talks about dressing for your personality, every designer who speaks of clothes that empower the wearer, every fashion column that treats clothing as a form of self-expression, all of it traces back to the philosophy Lucy stated plainly in the 1890s. When no one else in the industry had language for it. She articulated it first. She built a business around it. She defended it in print for 30 years. That is where it comes from. The first Hollywood look, the aesthetic that shaped how silent cinema presented its most visible women, was Lucile's. The images of Mary Pickford and Norma Talmadge and Marion Davies that circulated in fan magazines across America and Europe were images of women dressed in the visual language Lucy had spent 30 years developing in London fitting rooms. Those millions of women absorbed it without knowing whose hands had shaped what they were looking at. The credit went to the stars. The intelligence was hers. The legal case that carries her name, Wood v. Lucy, Lady Duff-Gordon, decided in 1917 by the New York Court of Appeals in an opinion written by Judge Benjamin Cardozo, is cited in American law school curricula every year. It established a foundational principle of implied obligation in contract law. Students learn her name as a legal landmark, a case name to be memorized. Almost none of them know what she made. Almost none of them can name a single gown. Her name endures in jurisprudence because she lost a business dispute, which is its own particular form of irony, for a woman whose greatest work lay not in contracts but in the creation of beauty. And in Titanic histories, the broad ones, the ones made into films and television programs and popular books, she appears as a footnote to Lifeboat 1. The woman in the almost empty boat. The designer who mourned a nitress. History has always had the freedom to choose which part of a complicated person it finds most useful. For most of a century, the lifeboat was more useful than the dress. Consider what that choice erased. A woman who started with nothing and built the first international couture house. Who invented the runway and trained the first professional models. Who understood, before anyone else had articulated it, that fashion was not about the garment but about the woman inside it. Who dressed queens and duchesses and film stars, and, when the fashion establishment objected, middle-class women browsing the Sears catalog at their kitchen tables because she saw no reason why beauty should be rationed by income. She gave her gowns names instead of numbers because she believed clothing was not a product. It was a feeling. A private conversation between the woman wearing the dress and the woman she knew herself to be. Give me your heart. The sighing sound of lips unsatisfied. Farewell summer. Poetry, stitched into silk, offered to women who wanted the world to see them clearly. And then, for most of a century, what the world saw instead was a wooden lifeboat, drifting on cold dark water with 12 people in it when it should have held 40. The dress in the Victoria and Albert Museum does not know any of this. It simply exists, pale silk, the ghost of embroidery, a silhouette that holds the memory of a woman who wore it once and the intelligence of the woman who made it. Both women are worth remembering. One is already in the museum. The other is the reason the museum wanted the dress. Her name was Lucile, Lady Lucy Duff-Gordon. The woman who invented the fashion show, trained the first models, and built the world's first international couture house, from her mother's drawing room, with a needle and thread and the unshakable belief that every woman deserved to walk into a room and feel entirely like herself. The Titanic remembered the lifeboat. Let us remember what she left behind.